Very big moment for the UK, big moment for the economy, enormous moment for politics. And there were lots of claims from the outgoing Prime Minister outside of Downing Street. So let's just look through that and also what the market reaction was, because, of course, you'll be familiar with recent Prime Ministers. When they go off and there's this big gilt market reaction. Did that happen this time around? Short answer, actually, no. Market's really quite sanguine about this, barely moving at all. Actually, the yield on the 10-year government bond, which is the kind of thing we mostly focus on, that actually came down a little bit, which is the opposite of what it did under Liz Truss. The higher this is, the higher the interest rate that the government faces, of course. The key thing really here, and there wasn't a massive reaction as well on currency markets. So markets, not fretting about what's going on. They everyone's seen the way this is going for quite some time. But here's what's significant, and I think is going to be a challenge for the next Prime Minister, is that when you compare the UK, and this line is obviously showing you the higher this is, the higher the interest rates that we face are. When you compare the UK with its other kind of G7 peers, so major industrialised economies, this blue area is where the rest are. And the key thing here is, back, before 2022, the UK was kind of middle of the pack. Look at the red line versus everyone else. It's kind of in the middle there, isn't it? Then you have the famous, infamous Liz Truss mini-budget. That line shoots up. And then it kind of comes down a bit. But really, ever since then, the UK has been the ugly duckling. And you can see that red line going higher and higher and higher to where we are now, and actually over the kind of Keir Starmer period in office, our government bond yields have just been consistently higher than everyone else's. And I think a lot of people will look at this and say that one of the litmus tests of what happens next is whether the next Prime Minister can bring that down, because it basically means you're not having to pay as much for your borrowing, and that makes everything else easier. But of course, Andy Burnham has said we should not be in hock to the bond markets. Well, like it or not, the UK has this enormous budget deficit. It needs to borrow the money from somewhere, or else everything basically shuts down. So you are kind of in hock to the bond market. So that's going to be a key thing to focus on. Another is growth, because the stronger the economy is growing, the more all of your problems basically seem to resolve themselves. And outside Downing Street, Keir Starmer talked about how our economy was going faster than our peers. And it's worth just fact-checking that. Definitely, in the last quarter for which we have data, the UK is the fastest. Look, 0.6% growth. That's the higher the bars are, the more the economy is growing. There's the UK, there's the US, Japan, Canada, the rest of the G7. But that's just the last 3 months, basically, 3 months at the start of the year. And a lot of people think that's a kind of bounce that you had before what happened in the Middle East, and so it might go down. If you look, faster than G7 over that quarter, if you look just over the year of 2025, actually suddenly the UK is kind of more middle of the pack. It's not bad growth at all. And actually the growth record for this latest Labour government, it hasn't been that bad. It's not great in comparison with, like, the 1990s. It's certainly not the fastest growth in the G7, which, remember, when Keir Starmer was coming into office, that's what he said he wanted to achieve. It's not that. He's failed on that front. But when it comes to, growth, it's stronger than much of Europe, stronger than Japan. It's just weaker than the US and Canada to some extent as well. And, of course, the US has had this amazing AI story. Same story, by the way. So that's just last year. If you look as well over the period that Keir Starmer has been in office, so since the middle of 2024, again, same thing. So mid-table, but considerably weaker than the US, but stronger than much of Europe. I think the bigger issue here, I'll show you this chart, because for me this kind of tells you so much of the story. The bigger issue here is this long-term problem that the UK faces, which is what you're looking at here is it's actually not just kind of gross domestic product. It's not just income we're generating. It's that divided by number of people in the country, so GDP per capita. And you can see it's rising and rising up until the financial crisis. And at that point in the financial crisis, if you just kind of took that line and continued it on, and yes, there are big questions over whether you can actually legitimately do that, but nonetheless, if you kind of continued that on in that direction, that's how much richer we would be getting. So that's basically how much richer we would be. But in the event that didn't happen, there was this big dip for the financial crisis, and then it did start growing, but it never got back onto that previous trajectory. And then you have COVID, and, we all know, again, what happened then. It looked like growth was heading in that direction, but the same thing happened. So you had this really big dip, but maybe even more significant than that dip is the fact the line never got back to where it was going before, let alone where it was going before 2008. And if you kind of just do a simple difference between that and that, you're talking about the fact that we as a nation are 24% poorer than we would have been had that performance continued. And I think, I think so many of our issues at the moment can be traced back to this chart. And again, the next Prime Minister is going to have to wrestle with that, as well as wrestling with the fact that when you kind of dissect different parts of the economy, there are some bits that are doing kind of OK, and there are some bits that are doing disastrously right now. This is showing you just economic growth in the last few years. This is going to bring, in total, about 2.8, 3% bigger over that period. And if you look at various different parts of the economy, it's kind of more or less the same. Construction, services, manufacturing, all doing kind of, all right. Now, look at chemicals. Just look at that. The chemicals sector, which is down by 20% over that period. And compare, where chemicals are, and you kind of get a sense, this is historically one of the most important parts of our manufacturing sector. Britain has been deindustrialising, and of course this dates back well before Keir Starmer came into office. But we have been deindustrialising, and that deindustrialisation has continued. And part of the issue here is if you look at kind of business confidence, and what I'll do, OK, so this is just showing you, when the bar is above the line, businesses are kind of happy, they just feel confident, they're replying to surveys saying, look, we're happy with the way things are going. And then when they're below the line, well, they're not very happy. And what you see here is, look, there's the trust period, the bars go down quite a bit, but then they kind of recover for the Sunak era. Look over here in the Starmer era, and there's a real pattern, isn't there? Basically, business has just been unhappy for so much of this period, and you can kind of understand why with higher national insurance and more of these regulations that they're concerned about. And I guess one of the questions now is, does the next Prime Minister have a more business-friendly approach? The other thing that's worth just focusing on economically is the state of the public finances. So, historically, Labour's been the party of tax and spend. This is showing you public spending. It's worth asking that question. Did that actually happen in the Starmer era? That's public spending as a percentage of GDP, and Rishi Sunak was going to cut that if he had won the last election. This is what Keir Starmer has done. So higher public spending. The line is a bit higher, but I mean, these are actually quite significant differences when you're kind of talking about percentages of GDP. It's a lot of money. With taxes, so that's spending, the tax burden was going to go up under Rishi Sunak, but also under Keir Starmer, it's going up even faster. So higher taxes under Keir Starmer, at least at the end of this Parliament. That's the plan. But the thing he talks about outside Downing Street that I think he would focus on is, look, what are you getting for that spending? And if we kind of look at this line here, that's net investment. And what I'll do is I'll just zoom into it. So we'll just, same data, but we're kind of just squidging up the axis. Net investment, Rishi Sunak was going to cut investment. And that was part of the answer for getting how he would get spending down. But look at under Keir Starmer. So higher investment, net investment. And that's, spending on hospitals, spending on schools, spending on the transport system. That, I think, is going to be one of the key things that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves talk about in the coming weeks is, look, we made a big change. The interesting thing is going to be whether whoever the next Prime Minister is, Andy Burnham, one presumes, is going to keep that in place because, it's quite expensive stuff, but certainly quite dramatic. A few other things worth just noting, higher investment there. NHS waiting lists. We heard from the Prime Minister saying that he brought them down. Did he bring them down? Well, this is quite a good way of showing it, OK? So basically, you want this line to be higher because that's showing you the percentage of patients receiving treatment within the 18-week target. There's various different ways of kind of slicing this data up. But the issue, you can see, like, in recent years, that's come down. Then it plunged during COVID, so terrible waiting list performances, down, down, down. That is the interim target. It used to be 92%, but that's the interim target that Labour set, so 65% of people kind of meeting that target. The line did get up, so that's over the period of the last couple of years. It did get up, and it just, in the last month or so, it went above that, but then it just came down, only by fractions of a percentage point, but nonetheless, it's just come down. But yeah, they hit that target, certainly. He also talked about small boats, so, there's been a lot of talk about small boats. This is just showing you each year, we're going back to kind of 2019 here, and each of these lines follows the year and how the numbers of small boats coming across the channel into the country rose and rose over each of those years. And is it really true that small boat crossings have fallen? Well, they were very high in 2025, which of course was under Keir Starmer. But 2026, for for the first time in quite a while, they are, considerably lower. And so these are the different things. Clearly, he was going through a list of here are the achievements that we have come through. That is one of them that he will focus on. And also, I could show you, the migration numbers, which also have started to come down. But there are going to be, doubtless, over the course of the next few weeks, many more obituaries, many more analyses, both about what Keir Starmer meant for the country, but also about what might have to follow him and what's the fate of the economy under the next Prime Minister.